American drug agents are calling it a victory, a major haul, thanks to a joint operation involving the U.S. Coast Guard and the Navy. These are new images of 3 tons of confiscated cocaine and 240 pounds of pot. These drugs were bound for the United States. They were seized, and they were seized in the waters off the coast of Florida. They're now being unloaded right now in Jacksonville, Florida. The drugs were confiscated aboard ships coming from Nicaragua and Colombia. It's part of the Obama administration's so-called balanced approach in the war on drugs, although many critics say it's not enough to win that war. Consider this. In 2009, the federal government spent $31 billion on drug control, but only 1/3 of that money on drug treatment. And our prisons, well, bears that out. In 2011, more than half of the inmates in federal prisons were serving time for drug offenses. Critics say those figures mean defeat. The big question remains, though, how do you win the war on drugs? So let's talk about that. Kevin Sabet is an assistant professor at the University of Florida and a former senior drug policy advisor for the Obama administration. And Ethan Nadelmann is the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. That's an organization that promotes alternatives to the war on drugs. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
The Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, calls the war on drugs a failure. Is he right, Ethan?
Well, he's clearly right. I mean, if you look at $1 trillion this country has spent over the last 40 years, and we still have significant levels of drug abuse, overdose fatalities are an all-time high. The seizure you mentioned, Carol, is really just a blip. It's going to have no impact on domestic drug markets. What's significant about Governor Christie saying what he's saying is that he's really the first major Republican figure nationally, a current and future leader in the Republican Party, who's saying this sort of stuff. And he's also been supportive of reducing the prison population in New Jersey. He supported the state's medical marijuana program. His health department is supporting needle exchange programs to reduce HIV and hepatitis C. So we're beginning to see some sort of bipartisan consensus that this war on drugs has failed, and we need to dramatically shift resources from interdiction enforcement to actually treatment, prevention, helping people, focusing on reducing the harms of drugs rather than locking up millions of Americans.
So it's kind of starting at a state level. In fact, New Jersey just passed a law that institutes a year of mandatory treatment instead of jail time. So, Kevin, why not suggest federal legislation requiring the same thing?
Well, we've had federal legislation mandating treatment instead of jail for a long time in the form of things like drug courts, which actually use the power of the criminal justice system to get people to treatment. And if they successfully complete treatment, they don't end up going to jail or having a criminal record. We also see this in Hawaii with projects like Project Hope, which is working with the probation system. I mean, focusing on the federal level may not be the best place, since most drug offenses happen on the state level. And you're seeing state innovations from Texas to Washington to Hawaii, which are all about reducing incarceration, but also protecting public safety and reducing drug use. So I agree with Ethan that we need to focus on prevention and treatment and rehabilitation, but going towards the way of legalization,
you know, we just look at those figures, $31 billion spent on fighting drugs in this country. Only 1/3 of that federal money is used for treatment programs. So why not use more of the money to treat drug abusers instead of spending it so much on these big hauls of drugs that don't seem to make a dent in the drug war?
Well, actually, there has been a recent shift over the last few years to a public health balanced approach. And again, most dollars, you're looking at federal budgets, but most treatment and prevention dollars are actually spent at the state and local level. So we need to be also careful what statistics we're looking at. I'm all in favor of treating this like a disease, looking at addiction as a health issue, but going towards legalization isn't the way to do it. Chris Christie is right. The war on drugs is a horrible analogy. It's actually an analogy the government hasn't used for years. Now, I think the last thing Governor Christie would want is legalization, however, because we see prescription drugs today are legal and they're available. Alcohol is legal, available, and so is tobacco. And we're doing a pretty bad job of preventing and treating those 3 legal drugs because they're available, they're promoted, and they're commercialized. I think that's the last thing we want to see for any other drug, whether it's marijuana or other drugs.
Ethan, I know you're in favor of legalizing marijuana, and it seems like that is catching on, although not in a big way. 15 states have passed laws decriminalizing pot, but would this help us win the war on drugs?
Well, I'll tell you, Carol, I mean, it is moving very rapidly. According to the Gallup polls, the percent of Americans who favor legalizing marijuana and regulating it, taxing it, more or less like alcohol, has jumped from 36% just 6 years ago to 50% now. So the country's basically evenly divided on this issue, and opinions are changing very quickly. But clearly it would help. I mean, the marijuana arrests do not account for the majority of people behind bars, but they account for half of all the drug arrests in the United States. Over 800,000 arrests a year just for possessing a little bit of marijuana. So if we were to tax, control, and regulate marijuana like alcohol, instead of persisting with this failed prohibitionist policy, state, federal, local governments would save 10, 20, maybe more billion dollars a year. We take in 10 to 20 billion dollars a year. And quite frankly, in terms of the risks, given how widely available marijuana is already, I think the risks of moving in that direction are dramatically less than the benefits.
Kevin, would you, although I read the Obama administration's drug policy, and this is what it says about marijuana use. Month to month, it's going up, marijuana use among teenagers. It says marijuana is very much a gateway drug because the perception of marijuana these days is it's not a dangerous drug. So you smoke marijuana, and then you move on to harder stuff. Actually, I'll let Ethan address that.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, I would say the gateway theory about marijuana is an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bull. I mean, on the one hand, most people who use heroin and cocaine use marijuana first, but the vast majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use harder drugs. They don't even go on to become regular marijuana users. If you look at the Netherlands, they more or less legalized marijuana 30 years ago. They did not see any dramatic jump in marijuana use. In fact, their rates of marijuana use are less than they are in the United States. Meanwhile, there's almost no heroin addiction left in the Netherlands. So there is not really that much of a relationship between marijuana use and the other drugs.
Kevin, last word.
Yeah, Carol, I don't necessarily disagree with the first part of what Ethan said, but the Netherlands, that country is totally reversing their policies because they have seen increases in marijuana use among their kids. We know that when drugs are legal, they're cheaper, they're more available, than they're promoted, as we've seen for alcohol. So I think alcohol would be the last model we'd want to look at for marijuana. In fact, more people are arrested for alcohol offenses every year than all drugs combined because more people use alcohol and it's much more prevalent. So I'm not saying we need to arrest and jail marijuana users for long amounts of time, but having some kind of stigma on the actual use itself while also getting treatment and intervening on early use. And by the way, getting medical professionals involved. The #1 drug problem today is overdoses due to prescription drugs. We need to educate the medical profession, have them intervene early so we can prevent, treat this, and truly treat this like a public health issue. Legalization would be the opposite of treating it like a public health issue.
We shouldn't be arresting marijuana users at all, Kevin.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, but I have enjoyed this discussion. I'm sorry, we have to leave it there. Kevin Sabet, Ethan Nadelmann, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Carol.
We most definitely want to know what you think about this. What is the best way to win the war on drugs? Legalizing marijuana? Facebook.com/CarolCNN.